At least the army pays her rent. The laughter came first, polished, practiced, the kind that slides easily out of champagne glasses and expensive throats. My father's voice followed smooth as ever, carrying across the ballroom like a speech he'd given too many times. I froze in the doorway. The marble floor gleamed beneath my shoes, the air thick with perfume and pride. A senator laughed. A banker nodded approvingly. The string quartet played softly, oblivious. And my father, Richard Hayes, real estate mogul, civic philanthropist, master of optics, stood under the chandelier holding court. My court once, my family once. At least the army pays her rent, he repeated louder now, smiling like it was harmless. Polite laughter again, the kind that hides discomfort. He hadn't seen me yet, but the general beside me had. He turned toward the doorway, toward the sound of my father's arrogance, and his expression hardened just slightly, but enough. "Major General Hayes," he said quietly, "we're ready." I stepped forward. The sword at my side brushed against my hip, the ceremonial one polished mirror bright. The medals on my chest caught the light. 2 silver stars glinted from my shoulder boards. And that's when my father saw me. The room fell into silence so deep I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. His eyes widened. The smile slid off his face. The wine glass in his hand tilted, spilling a dark stain across his cuff. The general turned toward him. "That's your daughter." My father didn't answer. He couldn't. That was the night everything came full circle. But the road to that moment, to that silence, had started years earlier, long before the medals and the marble floors. Long before anyone called me general. It began in a kitchen in Fairfax, Virginia, when I was 18, and my father told me that dreams were only respectable if they made money. He was the kind of man who measured worth by square footage. His life was blueprints and bottom lines. The house I grew up in had more rooms than people, but not enough warmth to fill a single one. "College first," he said that morning, pouring coffee like he was conducting business. "You'll intern at the firm after sophomore year. Real estate, Grace. That's how you build something real." I looked at the recruitment pamphlet in my hands. United States Army. Be all you can be. "I already signed the papers," I said quietly. His hand froze midair. The cup rattled against the saucer. "Signed." "Yes, sir. Enlisted." The word sir was instinct, then not respect. He laughed to sound like a door slamming shut. "You're joking." I wasn't. His face changed slowly. Amusement, giving way to fury, then disbelief. Then something colder. "You have a full ride to Georgetown. You're throwing that away for what, to polish boots?" "To serve," I said simply. He shook his head. "You want to play soldier? Fine. Don't expect me to bankroll it." "I'm not asking you to." He didn't speak again. He just walked away out the door into the world that always agreed with him. That was the last morning I ate breakfast in that house. Basic training stripped away everything he ever told me mattered: the car, the clothes, the comfort. It left muscle grit and quiet. It taught me that worth isn't declared in speeches, but earned in sweat and sleepless nights. When letters home went unanswered, I stopped writing. The army became my family. Duty replaced approval. I rose through the ranks, one order at a time, one deployment at a time, one loss at a time. But the wound he left that need to prove something never really healed. It just hardened into focus. Years later, when command came with its 2 stars, my mother sent a short message through an old friend. "He saw your promotion on TV. He didn't say much, just left the room." That was all she wrote. I thought I'd buried it, the need for him to know, to see. But then the invitation came. It was an official military event co-sponsored by a veterans fund and several civilian supporters. The host, Richard Hayes Development Group. The name made me laugh. He hadn't supported a soldier in his life. I wasn't invited as family. I was there as part of the escort team for the visiting general. When I saw the name on the program, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not pride, just a cold resolve. I'd stand in that ballroom as everything he'd once said I could never be. The knight came dressed in glass and gold, Laughter spilled through the hall before the first toast. My father stood near the podium, shaking hands with a congressman the same way he used to shake mine before sealing a deal. I watched from the entryway, unseen, the sound of his voice tugging at memories I didn't want to keep. At least the army pays her rent. The same cadence, the same smug rhythm. He'd always thought military life was for people without options, never realizing that choosing service over privilege was the hardest option of all. When the general announced my name, I stepped into the light boots, clicking against marble. The air shifted. Conversation stopped. "Major General Hayes," he said, smiling with pride. "Welcome." My father's eyes locked on my uniform, the ribbons, the sword, the stars. I saw realization break across his face like dawn after a long storm. He looked around as if searching for a script that didn't exist. There was no applause to hide behind this time. "That's your daughter?" the general asked. My father's lips parted, but no words came out. I saluted. "Sir," I said to the general, not to him. Then I turned toward the flag at the far end of the hall and held my salute a little longer than necessary. Not for the crowd, not even for the general, but for the girl who'd left that house with a duffel bag and a spine she didn't know she had. That night, for the first time, silence spoke louder than his laughter ever had. And I knew then my revenge wasn't humiliation. It was existence, visible, undeniable, unshakable. I didn't see him approach until later after the ceremony ended and the crowd began to thin. He stood near the doorway, eyes uncertain, hands still. "Grace," he said quietly, "you look different." I answered. He wanted to say more, but didn't. Pride, even wounded, still ruled him. That was fine. I'd already said everything I needed to without a single word. That's how my story began, not with anger, but with silence. Not with war, but with a choice. Not with a man's approval, but with a woman's purpose. And it would take years, miles, and more battles than he'd ever understand to reach that ballroom again, as a daughter reborn through discipline, through service, through loss. The road between that kitchen and that gala was long, and it began with the moment I walked away. The night after the gala, I couldn't sleep. The image of my father's face, drained of color, eyes wide, lips, barely moving, kept replaying like a movie I couldn't turn off. But that moment didn't come from nowhere. It was built brick by brick, year by year, out of arguments, silence, and the kind of disappointment that never gets spoken out loud. I grew up in Fairfax County, Virginia, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. White columns, oak door flag on the porch. My father, Richard Hayes, owned half the skyline in Arlington. My mother hosted charity teas. My brother Ethan was the golden boy captain of everything full ride to Wharton. And me, I was the quiet one who loved old movies and history books. When I was 10, I wrote an essay called "Why I Want to Serve My Country." My teacher read it to the class. My father threw it away when I brought it home. "We don't raise servants in this family," he said. "We raise leaders." I didn't argue then. I just learned early that his definition of leadership didn't leave much room for honor. By the time I finished high school, Ethan already had a business card with his name next to my father's. At graduation dinner, my father handed him a Rolex. To me, he handed a brochure for Georgetown. "Your ticket to something real," he said. Not uniforms and salutes. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen with the Army recruiter's card in my hand. The number was already memorized. When I told him I'd enlisted, he didn't shout. He just looked at me like I'd spat on the family crest. "You'll regret this, Grace. You could be running offices by 25. Instead, you'll be taking orders from people who couldn't pass a real entrance exam." "I'd rather take orders than sell condos," I said. He didn't answer. He just wrote a check to close my college fund and left it on the counter unaddressed. That was his way of saying goodbye. My mother cried at the bus station, pressing a photo of us into my hand. "He doesn't mean it," she whispered. "He just doesn't understand people who serve for reasons he can't count." I hugged her tight and stepped onto that bus with a duffel bag and a head full of noise. I remember the driver calling out Fort Benning next stop and thinking I'm finally free. Basic training at Benning stripped away everything my father ever told me I needed. Nobody cared who my dad was. Nobody asked. My hands blistered. My back ached. My pride dissolved and rebuilt itself into discipline. There was a morning when we were crawling through mud under barbed wire and a girl beside me. Private Lee lost her grip crying. I grabbed her wrist, pulled her forward, shouted, "You've got this," without realizing I believed it. That was the first time I felt real leadership, not in control, but in service. At night, I wrote letters home. My mother replied with short notes, always in her soft handwriting. "Your father's busy, but he's glad you're doing well." I knew that was a lie. Still, I kept writing. Hope can be stubborn like that. Deployment came faster than I expected. I was 22 when I landed in Kandahar. The air tasted like sand and jet fuel. Our mission was logistics support, nothing heroic, just long hours and quiet danger. The kind that doesn't make headlines but fills cemeteries. One night, a roadside IED turned our convoy into chaos. Our CO went down shrapnel in his leg, screaming orders we couldn't hear. I took command without thinking, shouting directions through smoke and noise. We made it out. Barely. But one man didn't. Private Collins, 19, from Nebraska. I held pressure on his wound until the helicopter came. He died 5 minutes later, staring up at the same stars my father measured his success by. After that, something in me changed. I stopped needing validation. I just needed purpose. Years passed. Promotions came not because I chased them, but because I refused to quit. Captain, then major, then colonel. The Army became the family that never asked me to be someone else. The men and women beside me judged me by one thing. Did I do my job? Back home, Ethan's name started showing up in the business pages. Embezzlement, whispers, construction lawsuits, a failed development project my father paid millions to bury. When my mother sent me a clipping about their success, I barely recognized them. Smiles suits headlines about philanthropy. They looked proud. I just felt distance. After 15 years of service, I came back to D.C. for training at the War College. That's when I ran into an old family friend, someone from those high society dinners I used to avoid. He smiled too wide when he recognized me. "Grace Hayes. Haven't seen you in forever. Your dad must be thrilled." "Oh, wait. You're still military, right?" I laughed politely. "Still, and thriving." He blinked, not sure if it was sarcasm. That night, I looked at my father online. There he was smiling in front of a banner that read, "Patriot Builders, supporting America's veterans." He'd turned my service into a brand campaign. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall for a long time. Anger wasn't the right word. It was smaller than rage, bigger than pain. It was the quiet, steady kind of disappointment that hums just beneath your heartbeat. The next day, my CO called me into his office. "You've been selected for a senior command post, Major Hayes. Congratulations." He slid the folder across the desk. I opened it. 2 silver stars. My first thought wasn't pride. It was, he'll hear about this. When my promotion made the local news, my mother sent another note. He watched the segment, didn't say anything, just turned off the TV. I smiled when I read it. Silence again, the same weapon he always used, only now it worked in reverse. Because his silence no longer hurt. It confirmed that I had become everything he feared, independent, respected, untouchable. So when I got that assignment to escort a visiting general to a civilian charity gala and saw the sponsor's name, Richard Hayes Development Group, I almost laughed out loud. Fate, it seems, had a sense of humor. I didn't plan to speak to him. Didn't even plan to make eye contact. I just wanted to stand there in my dress blues, my sword at my side, and let the truth exist in plain sight. But then, he said those words. At least the Army pays her rent, and everything I'd buried surfaced at once. It wasn't rage that filled me. It was clarity. All those years of proving myself had led to one moment walking into that ballroom, not as his daughter, but as the woman he'd tried so hard not to see. You don't plan revenge when you've already outgrown it. You just arrive. And that night, I arrived. Combat doesn't announce itself with drums or speeches. It just happens one heartbeat. You're joking about rations the next. You're on the ground. Dirt in your teeth, praying the radio still works. I learned that lesson in Kandahar summer of 2011. The heat pressed on us like an extra layer of armor. I'd been in country for 5 months leading a logistics unit responsible for supply routes. Nothing glamorous, but vital. We kept the lifeline running through miles of open desert, the kind where the horizon looks close enough to touch, but never comes nearer. That morning began like any other inspection route, brief prayer whispered by one of the guys, who never admitted he believed in anything. Then, wheels up. We rolled out in a convoy of 5 Humvees, the kind of formation that looked solid from above but felt fragile from the driver's seat. Private Collins sat up front with me, a 19-year-old from Nebraska, with a laugh too big for the desert. He talked about his mom's peach pie and how he planned to surprise her with a visit when we rotated home. I told him to hold that thought. Halfway through the route, the comms cracked static, then a warning, possible IED ahead. We halted. My instincts tightened like a coiled spring. Everything was too quiet. No wind, no birds, no sound but the ticking engine. Then the world went white. The explosion lifted the second vehicle clean off the road. Shrapnel sliced the air hot and screaming. I hit the dirt ears, ringing vision, swimming in dust and fire. Someone yelled, "Man down!" I crawled toward the voice. Sergeant Martinez was bleeding badly, leg shredded. I pressed a tourniquet with shaking hands while yelling for the medic. Collins was already moving too far forward too fast. "Private, hold your position," I shouted. He didn't hear. Another blast tore through the ground, flipping debris into the sky. When I reached him, he was still breathing, eyes wide and terrified. I told him he'd be fine. He tried to laugh. "Guess I'll miss that pie." Then his chest stilled. I carried him to the medevac myself. Dust clung to his uniform, to mine, to the memory that still hasn't washed off. The Army teaches you to compartmentalize, to stack pain in tidy boxes so you can keep moving. I got good at that. We cleaned up the site, sent reports, finished the mission. The next day, I wrote a letter to Collins's mother. I told her he was brave, steady, and that his last words were about home. I didn't tell her I'd promised him everything would be fine. You don't tell mothers things like that. When we rotated stateside, the world felt smaller. Civilians asked if I'd seen combat like it was something to check off a list. I just said, we all did our part. That seemed to make them comfortable. But at night, comfort was the last thing on my mind. I started waking up before dawn, running until my legs went numb. Some mornings I'd look out over the base and think of that desert road, how fast life could turn, how thin the line between duty and regret really was. Command noticed. They called it discipline. I called it survival. Promotion came in quiet ways, one more responsibility, one fewer friend left in uniform. Eventually, I took command of a logistics battalion. Paperwork replaced patrols, but the weight never changed. I learned to read men's faces the way my father once read contracts, looking for the lies beneath the smiles. And still the letters home went unanswered. My mother sent brief notes, birthdays, holidays, always careful, always kind. Your father asks about you, she'd write. I knew that wasn't true. Silence had become his language. But I also knew that silence couldn't erase what I'd become. By 2018, I'd earned my first star. The ceremony was small, quiet, exactly the way I wanted it. I thought about Collins, about Martinez, about every name written in the dusty corners of my mind. When I pinned the insignia on, I felt nothing like pride. It was heavier than that, like holding someone else's unfinished work. Then came the phone call. "Colonel Hayes, this is headquarters. You've been selected for promotion to Major General. 2 stars. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the desk. The same girl who once took a bus from Fairfax with nothing but a duffel bag was now being asked to lead an entire command. When I told my mother, she cried. When she handed the phone to my father, he said only congratulations. The line went dead before I could answer. That was all the closure I got. War doesn't end when the bullets stop. It lingers in the small spaces when you buy groceries and flinch at dropped cans, when fireworks make you tense instead of smile when you see a folded flag. and feel your throat close. But those things also sharpen gratitude. Every day you wake up breathing feels borrowed. Every act of kindness feels earned. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about what Collins would have been by now, 30 maybe with kids. I kept his name on a slip of paper in my wallet. Not for guilt, for grounding. Because you can't spend your life trying to prove someone wrong if you don't remember who you're trying to be right for. Years later, when the Hamilton Grand assignment came across my desk, the same one my father sponsored, I almost ignored it. But something in me wanted to see if time had humbled him. I told myself it was duty. Maybe it was curiosity. I didn't know that walking into that ballroom would bring every ghost, every lesson, every quiet victory back into one shining moment. The battlefield wasn't just a place in Afghanistan. It was the distance between me and him, the war that never made headlines but shaped us both. And when I finally met his eyes again, I realized something no uniform could teach. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply surviving well enough to be seen. Coming home is supposed to feel like peace. It didn't. When I returned stateside, the world felt smaller, softer, and somehow louder. Grocery store aisles blared pop music. People argued over Wi-Fi speed. At church, they prayed for blessings instead of strength. The triviality of it all made me restless. I'd served 20 years. 20. The number sounded impossible. My knees ached when I ran, and the faces in my unit were younger every year. The Army had become my entire life, and it had also made me a stranger to the rest of the world. When I was reassigned to the Pentagon for senior command training, I thought maybe I'd find my footing again. D.C. was sharp, full of energy, full of politics, a city where uniforms still turned heads. I wore mine proudly, 2 silver stars gleaming. But inside I felt hollow, like I'd left something unfinished halfway across the ocean. Then one morning, while going through logistics reports, my aide dropped a stack of event folders on my desk. "Ma'am, he said you're scheduled to attend the Veterans Honor Gala next week. You'll be representing command." "Who's the sponsor?" I asked, flipping open the cover. He cleared his throat. "The Hayes Development Group." I froze. "Repeat that." "Yes, ma'am. Richard Hayes. It says he's being recognized for civilian support of veterans." I laughed. It wasn't bitter, just absurd. My father, who once said soldiers were state employees with guns, was now a patron of patriotism. The aide didn't know the irony. "Should I confirm attendance, ma'am?" "Yes," I said finally. "We'll attend." Because if life wanted to write irony this well, I wasn't going to stop it. That week, I buried myself in work. Reports, reviews, briefings, anything to keep my mind from drifting backward. But every night when I hung up my uniform, I found myself staring at the empty space on my wall where the family photo used to hang. I'd taken it down years ago, my father shaking Ethan's hand, my mother smiling, and me off to the side in a ROTC uniform he hadn't even noticed. My mother called 2 nights before the gala. "Grace. Hi, Mom. Your father doesn't know you're attending?" "Does he?" "No. He should. He'd want to be prepared." "For what?" "To make another speech about how embarrassing his daughter is." She sighed. "He's changed, honey." I smiled at the ceiling. "So have I." She hesitated, her voice small. "He's proud, you know. He just doesn't know how to show it." "That's fine," I said softly. "I'll show him instead." The Hamilton Grand Hotel stood like a cathedral of glass and marble, its lobby flooded with warm light and expensive perfume. I arrived early with the escort team clipboard in hand, checking logistics, confirming seating charts. I was a soldier again, professional, detached, unreadable. Still, when I saw his name printed in gold on the program, Richard Hayes, Recipient Patriot of the Year, my chest tightened. As guests began to arrive, I stayed near the entrance. It was easier to observe from the shadows. My father entered right on schedule with his perfect hair and perfect suit, surrounded by donors and reporters. His laugh was exactly the same, the kind that could charm a room and freeze his daughter. The general I was assigned to escort shook his hand. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your support." My father smiled confident. "It's the least I can do. My daughter serves, you know. At least the Army pays her rent." He said it casually, like a joke he'd used before. The group laughed. My breath caught, but I didn't move. The general looked puzzled. Your daughter's in the service? Yes, my father said proudly, though she's more of a bureaucrat now, I think. Hardly front lines. My stomach twisted. Even when trying to boast, he belittled. He couldn't help himself. Then the general glanced my way and smiled. Funny you mentioned that, Richard. I believe you'll be meeting her in a moment. My father blinked, confused. I'm sorry. The general nodded to me. Major General Grace Hayes, my escort officer for tonight's presentation. Every eye turned. I stepped forward, posture straight, chin high, every ounce of composure drilled into me over decades of service. The music softened. The room went still. My father's glass tilted. A red stain bloomed across his sleeve. The general extended his hand to me. Welcome, General Hayes. Thank you, sir. My voice didn't tremble. He looked between us, then asked almost softly, That's your daughter. No one breathed. Yes, my father said, finally voice barely audible. I saluted the flag, not him. The ceremony went on, speeches and tributes blending into one another. I stood tall, listening, smiling when necessary, pretending not to feel the weight of his gaze. When it was my turn to speak, presenting the colors and delivering a short address on service, I looked out at the crowd. For a moment, I met his eyes. Service, I said, isn't about the size of a paycheck or the size of a house. It's about showing up when others step back. It's about humility in the face of pride and the strength to act when recognition doesn't come. No one clapped at first. Then slowly applause built, steady, sincere. My father looked down, hands clasped. I wondered what he was thinking. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. After the gala, he found me in the hallway outside the ballroom. Grace, Dad. He looked unsure for the first time in his life. You were incredible up there. Thank you. He hesitated, searching for words. You look strong. I am. He nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't know you were. Because you never asked, I said, finishing it for him. He winced. You're right. Silence settled between us, the kind that used to hurt, but now just felt final. I'm proud of you, he said at last. I looked at him carefully. Be proud of what I do, not of who you think I am. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing more to say. I left first this time. As I walked to my car, the city lights reflected off the sword at my side. It gleamed faintly, like an old promise kept. That night, I didn't feel revenge. I felt release. He'd seen me. That was enough. And somewhere deep inside, I realized the battlefield was over. But the reckoning was still to come. The gala was meant to celebrate veterans, but under all that light and linen, it felt more like a performance about gratitude than gratitude itself. The chandeliers dripped crystal. Waiters floated between tables, balancing trays of champagne. Everyone was smiling, rehearsed. I'd been to enough of these events to know the choreography by heart, speeches, applause, donations, photographs, and the polite forgetting afterward. But that night, the air held something different. Maybe it was the echo of my father's joke. Maybe it was 20 years of silence hanging between us like smoke. Whatever it was, I could feel it pulsing through the crowd. I stood near the stage beside the visiting general posture, exact sword at my side. Every movement felt deliberate. From across the ballroom, I watched my father work the room with the ease of a man who'd never known what it meant to earn his place in one. He shook hands, told stories, smiled the same glossy smile he'd used all my life. The announcer's voice broke through the hum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major General Grace Hayes, United States Army. A few polite claps. Most didn't recognize the name, but my father did. He turned just as the spotlight shifted. I walked across the stage, every step, measured the sound of my heels sharp against the marble. My sword tapped once against my leg. The metals across my chest caught the light like a reflection off water. The general saluted. I returned it with precision. Major General Hayes, he said, thank you for leading tonight's presentation. The room fell silent. Even the violinist's bow hesitated mid-air. I turned toward the podium. My voice carried evenly, calm, and practiced. Tonight we honor not just service, but the quiet kind of courage that doesn't make headlines. The kind that wakes up before dawn, keeps promises in dust and danger, and expects nothing in return. Applause rippled through the room, genuine this time. The general nodded in approval. I looked down at my father. He sat at a table near the front, hands folded, gaze locked on me. For the first time, he looked small. After the ceremony, the band struck up an upbeat tune and the lights dimmed for dinner. I found a quiet corner near the back wall. Crowds make me restless. The general stopped by long enough to shake my hand and say, "Outstanding work, Hayes." Then he disappeared into a circle of admirers. My father didn't approach right away. I could see him hesitating by the dessert table, pretending to check his phone. Old habits die hard. He was still calculating, trying to measure the right moment, the right line. When he finally came over, I was half expecting the usual, some comment about posture or medals, or maybe a jab disguised as pride. But his voice was different. "Grace," he said. "That was remarkable." I nodded. "Thank you for sponsoring the event, sir." He flinched at "sir." I meant it politely, but it drew a boundary he could feel. "You didn't tell us you'd made general," he said. "You didn't ask?" I replied. He smiled faintly, eyes wet. "You sound just like your mother when she's right." That almost made me laugh. Almost. We stood there in awkward silence while people mingled around us. Waiters cleared glasses. The air smelled faintly of roses and champagne. For the first time, I saw the lines in his face, deep, weary, older than I remembered. He said quietly, "You were always tougher than I understood. And you were always prouder than you admitted." He exhaled as if laying down a weapon he'd carried too long. I said some cruel things. "Yes," I said. "You did." He looked at the floor. "I wanted to scare you away from pain. Instead, I taught you how to live with it." There, it was not an apology, but the beginning of one. "Dad," I said softly, "you can stop trying to rewrite the past. Just start showing up for the present." He met my eyes. "Then tell me how." "Come to the VA with me tomorrow. No cameras, no plaques. Just coffee with people who've earned what this room only talks about." He blinked. "Would they even want me there?" "They don't need you to fix them," I said, "just to listen." Later that evening, when the gala began to empty, I stood outside under the portico. The city was cold and quiet, the kind of DC night that hums with distant traffic and memory. My father walked up beside me, coat draped over his arm. For once, he didn't fill the silence. We just stood there. The valet brought his car around. He turned to me before getting in. "You were right about the army," he said. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to." He paused, then added, "You make me proud, Grace." I smiled, not bitterly, not triumphantly, just with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Then maybe we're both finally learning something. When his car disappeared down the street, I stood for a moment longer, hand resting lightly on my sword's hilt. The blade had always symbolized service, ceremony, protection. But that night, it felt like closure. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even proud. I was simply whole. Inside, a janitor began clearing tables. The sound of clinking glass echoed through the hall. I looked back, once the same room where he'd laughed at me hours earlier, and whispered to no one in particular, "At least the army pays her rent, huh?" Then I smiled, because now those words meant nothing. And I was finally free from needing them to mean anything at all. That was the night the story turned from revenge to release. He saw me for who I was. I saw him for who he'd never been brave enough to be. Neither of us won, but maybe that was the victory. The morning after the gala, I woke before dawn. Old habits never die. They just find quieter reasons to stay. I brewed a cup of black coffee and stood by the window of my quarters, watching the pale light spill across the Potomac. The city was just waking commuters' buses, the low hum of a country that keeps moving even when you're standing still. I thought about his face, the shock, the tremor in his hand, the quiet after that question. "That's your daughter." For years, I'd imagined the moment he'd see me again, the apology that would follow the cinematic closure every daughter dreams of. But life doesn't hand out tidy endings. It just opens a door and waits to see if you'll step through. At 8 sharp, my phone buzzed. Grace. His voice was hesitant thin. For the first time, he sounded unsure of himself. Dad? Can we meet? I hesitated. Every instinct told me to say no, to let the silence stay broken, just once then seal it forever. But something in his voice wasn't arrogance anymore. It was humility, maybe even regret. All right, I said. The VA hospital noon. If you really want to see what service looks like, that's where you'll find it. He arrived right on time in a tailored suit that didn't fit the fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria. The smell of disinfectant and weak coffee filled the air. Veterans sat in wheelchairs, trading jokes sharper than the scalpels in the surgical ward. A nurse passed by and nodded at me. General Hayes, she said warmly. My father blinked, startled. He wasn't used to seeing people greet me with respect he hadn't granted. We sat across from each other at a small metal table. I folded my hands. So, why now? He looked down at his untouched coffee. Because I saw something last night I'd never seen before. I saw what I threw away. I didn't respond. Letting him sit in his own silence felt right. He cleared his throat. You were right. About everything. About service honor. About me. I almost smiled. That's a lot of ground to cover. He exhaled slowly. I was afraid of losing control. You joined a world I didn't understand, one I couldn't buy my way into. I mocked it because I was jealous of the part of you that didn't need me. There it was, the truth unclothed, simple and late. I nodded. You know, Dad, I used to think you hated me for leaving, but now I think you just hated the mirror I held up to you. He looked up. That's fair. We sat there for a long time saying nothing. Around us, nurses moved like quiet angels. Veterans laughed too loud, and somewhere down the hall, a television played a rerun of MASH. Finally, I slid a volunteer badge across the table. You want to start making amends? Put this on. Help serve coffee. Listen, that's all they need here. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands like it was made of gold. Would they even want me here? They don't care who you were, I said. They care what you're willing to do now. The first time he poured coffee for a veteran in a wheelchair, his hands trembled. Thanks, man, the veteran said, grinning. Not bad for a rookie. My father laughed softly, an honest laugh, not the rehearsed one I'd grown up with. We spent hours walking those halls. He stopped to talk with a double amputee who cracked jokes about his prosthetics, then with a nurse who'd served 3 tours before coming home to care for others. I watched my father's eyes shift not out of pity, but awakening. As we left, he said, You see these people every day. Not all of them, I replied, but I see what they stand for. He nodded slowly. I wish I'd understood that sooner. You couldn't, I said gently. You never had to earn anything the hard way. That night, he showed up at my base housing unannounced. He carried a small box. Before you say anything, he said, just open it. Inside was an old photo, me at 18, standing in my ROTC uniform, smiling nervously. It had been torn once, taped back together. Behind it was a folded letter, his handwriting. I looked up. You wrote this. 10 years ago. Never mailed it. I unfolded it. Grace, if you're reading this, it means I've learned something. I used to think honor came from success, from recognition, from being the man in the room everyone turned to. You taught me it comes from standing for something bigger than yourself. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll know I was proud, long before I said it. I folded it back carefully. You could have just sent it. He smiled sadly. I didn't think I'd earned the stamp. Weeks passed. Every Friday, he returned to the VA with donuts and bad jokes. The veterans called him Rich. Not Sir. Just Rich. He loved that. When the local paper did a short piece on volunteer programs, they featured him in a photo pouring coffee beside me. The caption read, Former developer finds purpose serving those who served. He sent me the clipping with a note. You were right. Service isn't about who salutes first. It's about who stays when everyone else leaves. One Sunday afternoon, he called. Can we have dinner? I agreed. He cooked for the first time in his life, burned the chicken, laughed until he coughed. When the meal ended, he said, Grace, you ever think about what you'll do when you retire? I smiled. Teach. Maybe run a leadership program for girls who want to serve. He nodded thoughtfully. Good. The world needs more like you. That silence after soft, comfortable was worth every battle we'd fought. When I drove him home that night, he said something I'll never forget. You know I spent half my life building houses. You spent yours building people. Turns out yours last longer. I laughed quietly. That's because mine can stand on their own. He chuckled. Fair enough. At the next red light, he looked out the window. I'm sorry, Grace. I didn't answer right away. Then softly, I know. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was the kind of peace that doesn't demand more. As I dropped him off, he turned and said, You remember that night, the gala? How could I forget? He grinned. Next time you walk into a room like that, I want to be the one standing up first. You already did, I said. He nodded, closing the door with a smile that felt final, not sad, like a salute returned across time. That night, as I hung up my uniform, the stars on my shoulders caught the lamplight, 2 bright points against the dark fabric. I thought of him pouring coffee of Collins's mother, of the people who'd shaped both my battles and my peace. For the first time in years, I felt light enough to breathe. A few months later, winter came early to Virginia. The first frost painted the lawns silver outside my window, and the flag above the base stirred in the cold morning wind. I watched it move, thinking of the journey it had silently witnessed, from anger to understanding, from pride to peace. My father called once a week now, sometimes to talk about the VA, sometimes just to tell me about the weather, as if we were both relearning how to speak to each other without the past sitting between every word. The veterans loved him. They teased him, called him the coffee guy, and he took it in stride. He never mentioned business anymore. He'd sold most of his holdings quietly, sent anonymous donations to veteran scholarships, and told no one. They don't need my name, he said once. They need the help. One afternoon, I drove out to the VA unannounced. He was there reading to a group of older vets in the recreation room. His voice cracked once, and one of them, an amputee with a prosthetic leg, patted his shoulder. Take your time, Rich, the man said. It struck me then how life had reversed our roles. Once I'd been the one seeking his approval. Now he was learning how to stand under the weight of mine. When he noticed me, he smiled. Not the polished camera-ready grin I remembered, but something gentler. Real. Hey, General, he said softly. Hey, Dad. We walked outside together. When he finished the December light, thin but kind. He stuffed his hands in his coat pockets. You were right, he said. Service really does change people. I thought it was just uniforms and salutes. But it's something else, isn't it? I nodded. It's what's left when the applause fades. He laughed quietly. You always had a way of saying things that stick. I shrugged. The Army teaches efficiency. That Christmas, I invited my parents to dinner at my house for the first time. The table was modest, the kind where laughter sounds bigger than it should. My father brought a pie he'd baked himself badly, but we ate every bite anyway. When it was time for grace, he surprised me. He reached for my hand. This time, he said, I'll say it. His prayer was short, awkward, and sincere. For those who serve, for those who forgive, and for the second chances we don't always deserve. When he looked up, his eyes glistened. So did mine. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the window watching the snow begin to fall. My father's car was still in the driveway, dusted white under the streetlight. For years, I'd imagined vengeance as victory, him apologizing, me standing tall, the world balanced again. But revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes it's peace. Sometimes it's simply becoming the person you promised yourself you'd be, despite who they said you were. A week later, I gave a guest lecture at West Point. I told the cadets about leadership, not the kind that commands, but the kind that endures. Leadership, I said, isn't barking orders or collecting titles. It's holding yourself accountable when no one's watching. It's having the courage to face your own reflection even when what you see isn't perfect. They listened, heads high, notebooks open. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am," she asked, "what do you do when someone doesn't believe in you?" I smiled. "You outlast them," I said. "And when you finally meet their eyes again, make sure you don't see anger, see understanding. Because that's when you've really won." When I got back to my office that evening, there was a small envelope waiting on my desk. My father's handwriting. Inside, just a single line. "You taught me that honor isn't inherited. It's chosen. Every day. Proud to be your father, finally." I folded the letter, slid it into my desk drawer beside my dog tags, and whispered, "Finally's good enough." Weeks later, he passed quietly in his sleep. The funeral was small, just family, a few veterans, a folded flag. When the chaplain finished, I stepped forward and saluted. The wind caught the corners of the flag, snapping it against the winter air like the punctuation of a life redeemed. I didn't cry until afterward when I was alone, not from grief, but from gratitude, because not everyone gets to watch pride turn into humility or anger into grace. We did, and that was enough. When I returned home, I stood by my window again. Snow covered the lawn, and the flagpole outside swayed gently in the wind. The same wind that had followed me from Kandahar to Washington, from the kitchen where I left at 18 to the ballroom where I stood reborn. Honor, I realized, had nothing to do with uniforms or medals. It lived in the spaces between pride and forgiveness, in the quiet choice to keep showing up. Honor isn't about medals, applause, or rank. It's about consistency when no one's watching, humility after pride, forgiveness after anger. You can't rewrite the past, but you can live a future that heals it. If you've ever carried the weight of words that should never have been spoken, remember this: revenge might feel satisfying, but reconciliation lasts longer. Pride builds walls, understanding builds bridges. True victory isn't being right, it's being whole. If this story moved, you take a moment tonight to thank someone who served not with words, but with time. Call the person you've avoided. Write the letter you've delayed. And if stories like this remind you that courage and forgiveness still matter, please subscribe, share, and help us keep the honor line alive. Because sometimes the greatest battles end not with victory, but with understanding.